many people, safety was measured by injury rates, which encourages a focus on personal safety, not on process or major hazard safety. The top management, and there's an interesting twist to the story here, top management was accountable for safety in a more general sense, and they were evaluated using various performance metrics. These are the metrics that were finally being used in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010 to evaluate the performance of some of the senior managers. One of these was recordable injury frequency, but now process safety has finally appeared. Senior managers had loss of primary containment reduction targets, and bonuses depended partly on whether or not they achieved these targets. This is a big step forward for BP. They had finally introduced process safety metrics into their bonus arrangements. This was something that had been recommended after the Texas City accident, and they had finally done it. But there was a problem. BP was using this indicator company-wide. This was the only indicator of process safety they were using, and this is where they went wrong. Generally speaking, a loss of primary containment in the petroleum industry is a precursor to a major accident event. If you have a release of gas and if you have an ignition source present, then you're likely to have an explosion. Not every loss of containment results in an explosion, but by reducing the number of loss of primary containment events, you will reduce the risk of a major accident. That's the logic. That's fine for many parts of the petroleum industry, but in the drilling industry, the situation is different. The major accident event that you worry about is the blowout, and a loss of primary containment event is not a precursor to a blowout. Forcing managers to focus on loss of primary containment and to seek to drive that down was a fundamental mistake in the drilling industry. It encouraged them to worry about things like leaks from hydraulic hoses, which are not precursors to a major accident event. If you're trying to reduce the risk of blowout, focusing on loss of primary containment is not going to help you. It did focus the attention of production managers in the Gulf of Mexico on reducing the risk of fire or explosion, but there was nothing in the performance agreements of drilling managers in the Gulf of Mexico to focus their attention on blowout risk. This is why I say cost pressure was unconstrained for them. As far as drilling operations were concerned, there was nothing to counteract the overwhelming cost pressures. The problem was that BP had made a corporate decision that they were going to look for a single indicator of major hazard risk. It is possible to have a single indicator for personal safety performance. The injury frequency rate is a reasonable way of telling how well you are managing your ordinary risks. But we cannot have a single indicator of how well we are managing process safety risks. There is no single indicator. What we need to do is find indicators that are specific to the major hazards we are dealing with and try to drive those numbers down. Let's focus on a few examples where loss of primary containment is not relevant. It has no predictive power in the following incidents: road tanker accidents, collisions at sea, and of course blowouts. We need different kinds of indicators for those events. What is a precursor event to a blowout? Well, fairly obviously a kick. A kick is when oil and gas begins to enter the well and force its way upwards. If that happens, drillers have to close the well in and get it back under control. The number of kicks that you're experiencing is a potential indicator of how well you are managing your blowout risk. Another one might be the speed of response to those kicks. Drillers have to respond quickly when there is a kick. In the Gulf of Mexico, the Transocean drillers were not responding quickly. It took them 30 minutes to respond to one kick and 40 minutes to respond to another. This was much slower than it should have been. Clearly, these indicators are specific to drilling. The point is that you need to choose indicators that are specific to the particular hazard you are dealing with. The concept of process safety needs to be adapted to the particular situation. You have to adapt it to drilling, or to marine transportation, or to road transportation. Then you need to develop relevant indicators in those situations. BP had not adapted process safety to the drilling environment. All the lessons about process safety that have been learnt from the Texas City refinery disaster and other refinery and gas plants accidents basically passed them by because they had not adapted those lessons to their own particular circumstances. Let's look at another barrier that failed. This was the failure of pressure testing. They had finished the job and they needed to test whether the cement in place was holding. The way you do this is by temporarily reducing the pressure in the well to see what happens. If the cement has sealed the well properly, nothing will happen. But if the cement job has not worked and you reduce the pressure at the top, the oil and gas will come in at the bottom of the well and the pressure reading you see at the top will start to rise. What happened when they carried out the test was that the pressure began to rise, which was a clear indication, unmistakable, unambiguous, that the well was not sealed. But the people conducting the test could not accept that this was the case. They figured that they must have done something wrong, so they redid the test several times until finally they got a result that they could interpret as meaning that the well was properly sealed. They accepted that final test and declared that the well was safe. What was going on here? Well, first of all, they really had only a very hazy idea of what they were doing. If you're conducting a test at the bottom of the ocean, 1.5 kilometres below you, you need to have a fairly clear mental picture of what you're doing. They did not have that situational awareness. Situational awareness is a useful term. We can say the same thing about the operators in the Texas City refinery accident. They lacked any awareness of the situation they were in. Why did the Macondo team not have a clear picture? Partly because they had limited competency. These people were not professional engineers, they were tradesmen who had worked their way up the ranks and had learnt what they knew on the job. They didn't have the analytic or conceptual way of thinking that is more characteristic of professional engineers. This is something many observers remarked on when they discovered that there was not a single professional engineer on that rig, not a single qualified engineer. A lot of questions have been asked about whether this is the right way to operate an installation like this. This question first emerged after the Exxon accident at Longford in September in 1998, when we discovered the same thing, that there were no professional engineers on site at the time of the accident. Exxon had removed all its professional engineers from site and expected them to operate from head office, in that case in Melbourne. Many companies have since wrestled with this question: should we maintain professional engineers on site? The argument is that in the normal course of events we do not need them there. It's just a waste of resources to have them there on site. The contrary point of view is that it's when things are going wrong that you need that expertise on hand. There was no such expertise on the Deepwater Horizon, so the mistakes being made went unnoticed. Another factor in this story was the phenomenon of normalization. What is normalization? Normalization can happen when you're confronted with anomalies of various sorts. Anomalies are warnings that things may be going wrong, but it is often possible to explain them away as things that normally happen without any significant consequences, so that there is no need to worry about them. This process of normalization was going on in the decision-making group. How can you normalize a rising pressure? Well, they did. They believed that what they were seeing was a bladder effect. We do not need to know anything about the bladder effect theory except to say that it had no merit. Professional engineers have subsequently said that this was a theory without any basis. but the drillers were convinced of the validity of their theory and concluded that the rise in pressure was due to the bladder effect, not due to the failure of the well to seal. They normalised this rise in pressure in this way. The final aspect of this story is groupthink. If you get a small group of people together to make a decision, the assumption is that the decision will be unanimous. Everybody will agree. This means that if there are doubters in the group, if there are people who have a different point of view, enormous pressure is brought to bear on those people to change their mind and to agree with the dominant view. Where did the dominant view come from in this decision-making group? The group consisted of 2 BP company men and 2 or 3 drillers. Formally, legally, it was the 2 BP men who would make the decision. The reality is that the most powerful person in that group was a driller. The subculture of the drillers is enormously powerful and can often win out over company men on a rig. It was one of the drillers who suggested the bladder effect. The BP company guys were doubtful about it at first. They'd never heard of this before, but they did not feel able to override the views of the Transocean drillers. Indeed, one of them was teased by the drillers because of his doubts. He was teased into agreeing, and in the end he accepted the view of the drillers that it was reasonable to see the pressure rising in this situation because of the bladder effect. It's only if we understand this groupthink process that we can understand how the group came to its unanimous view that the well was secure. The Presidential Commission commented on this point and simply said, the BP company men were in error in accepting the view of the Transocean drillers. They should have asserted themselves because they had the authority to make the final decision in this situation. This view of the Presidential Commission fails to understand the social reality of the situation, that the culture of the drillers was so strong that it carried all before it. A further factor, and this is really the most important factor, was the belief that the well was already safe. The engineers had already previously declared that the well was safe, so what was this test about? It was not a genuine test in the minds of the people conducting it. They weren't seriously answering the question, is the well sealed or is it not? That was not the task. The task was to confirm that it was sealed. That is what they were doing. They were seeking to confirm what they already knew. If you approach the job in that way and get some results that tell you that the well is not sealed, of course you think you've made a mistake and you keep trying until you succeed in confirming what you know, namely that the well is sealed. In other words, a very powerful confirmation bias was at work. Confirmation bias is well recognised by social psychologists. We look for evidence that supports our view and we discard evidence that is inconsistent with our view. We are all guilty of selective use of evidence in this way. It's not an intentional process, it's unconscious. That is why the scientific method trains us to look for evidence that disconfirms our hypothesis. This is precisely to overcome the confirmation bias we all suffer from. The final point to explore is the failure to understand the very concept of defence in depth. The idea of defence in depth is that we need more than one safety barrier or defence because each defence is fallible. Since we cannot rely on any one defence, we must do our best to make sure that all the defences are functioning as well as possible. If we decide that a particular test we are doing is basically redundant because we believe that the first defence is effective, then we are not operating in accordance with the philosophy of defence in depth. In the minds of these drillers, one defence was good enough. In other words, they had no commitment to the philosophy of defence in depth. We need to train people to understand that they must put energy into making sure every defence has as much integrity as possible, because we never know when other defences will fail. The next major gap in BP's safety strategy was that the HSE staff was very much focused on occupational safety. Their view was that process safety was not part of their job. One of these HSE managers was asked at interview, well, what about major hazards? Who's responsible for that? If you're not responsible, who is?